And I'd like to hand over to Nikki.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm very happy to welcome Hayley Clements. She is based in South Africa at the moment, and she works at the Center for Sustainability Transitions, which is also known as the CST at Stellenbosch University. Hayley did her PhD at the University of Cape Town, and looking at socio-ecological systems. Well, she looks at socio-ecological ecosystems now, but she's focused on the role of private conservation areas. And then she did a postdoc at Monash University, and she's now doing a fellowship. You hold two sort of positions. You're at Stellenbosch University and also with the University of Helsinki. And she's currently managing two projects. One is a very ambitious project looking at developing a biodiversity impact index for Africa, which sounds like it's going to be really great when it's complete. And she's recently started working on a project assessing the role of sustainable use for biodiversity conservation, people and economies in Southern Africa. So yeah, thank you, Hayley, for joining us, and I want to get started.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Nikki. Thank you for having me. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the room and also some new faces. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share with you some of my research on conservation beyond state protected areas in Southern Africa. So let me just make this smaller so I can see what's going on here. Nikki, can you see my full screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So to start talking about this topic, I think that it is useful to have a bit of context in terms of some historical policy decisions that had quite long-lasting implications for conservation in Southern Africa. So under Roman Dutch law, and like many other places in the world, wildlife under the colonial system was deemed to be res nullius, which means owned by no one, which is different to, for example, domestic stock, livestock, and things that individuals can own. And this was interpreted in different ways by different states, but in many cases, it was deemed to be the responsibility of the state or the government to conserve and regulate wildlife. And in many cases, this meant restrictions on the use of wildlife by people in those countries. And what happened over time due to a lot of hunting is that wildlife numbers declined in many places in Southern Africa. And so the state responded by setting up state owned or managed protected areas in order to conserve wildlife. And of course, Southern Africa has many iconic national parks or protected areas in which wildlife is wonderfully conserved. But the consequence of these policy decisions is that there was little incentive for people outside of those parks to conserve wildlife. And so we saw wildlife numbers dwindling in many parts of Southern Africa. And this, of course, led to concern. And so there were conversations that started in the conservation communities and increasing recognition that perhaps the strategy of just conserving wildlife in parks and regulating it everywhere else, or its use everywhere else, was not going to be effective to conserve wildlife across the landscape. And so we started to see these shifting perspectives on conservation around the mid last century. And this is a quote out of the Arusha conference in 1963 that I think sums up this shift in perspective from preservation of wildlife and restricted use to recognizing that wildlife needs to be a viable land use for it to persist beyond parks. So here they say only by the planned utilization of wildlife as a renewable natural resource can its conservation and development be economically justified in competition with other land uses such as agriculture, stock ranching, etc. So really the shift in perspective towards sustainable use. And then what we see after this is the change in regulations in several Southern African countries, starting in Zimbabwe, as well as in Namibia and South Africa, where the use or ownership of wildlife was actually devolved to private landowners and to communities. And the way that it was devolved meant that these communities or private landowners could utilize wildlife, and the ways in which they could utilize it to be a viable land use or livelihood for them was through what we call the wildlife economy, which constitutes ecotourism, people coming to look at wildlife, hunting, that's both trophy hunting, where predominantly international tourists pay quite a lot of money to hunt beautiful trophies of animals, as well as what we call biltong hunting or game hunting, where people pay to come and shoot an animal for the pot to eat. Wildlife breeding, and it's important to realize that, so this is the sale of live wildlife animals, and it's important to recognize that hunting, particularly trophy hunting and wildlife breeding, are very interlinked, in the sense that when an animal is highly prized for trophy hunting, it drives up the live value of that animal as well, because people buy and sell that animal to breed, so to then result in trophy animals. So those two are very interlinked. And then there's venison sales as well, and also mixed farming. So actually many properties in Southern Africa that do livestock as well as some form of wildlife-based land use on their properties. And through this change in policy, which enabled the ownership and use of wildlife, which enabled this emergence of the wildlife economy, we start to see conservation beyond state protected areas across Southern Africa. So this is a map of Namibia, which borders South Africa, which shows you, in addition to state protected areas, these communal conservancies, as well as a range of freehold conservancies as well. And in South Africa, led by my colleague Alta de Vos, we actually tracked the policy changes in South Africa that contributed to the emergence of the wildlife economy over the last 60 or 70 years. So that's what you can see here. This is the number of protected areas, both state and private, over time in South Africa. And what's probably the most important act to flag is this Game Theft Act in 1991, which enabled private landowners to own wildlife if they could demonstrate that it was theirs through what they call the Certificate of Adequate Enclosure, which is the fencing of a property so that wildlife can't move around. They are maintained within that area, and therefore you can demonstrate that they're yours. And what's also quite interesting to flag on this figure is what happened when democracy occurred in South Africa in 1994. We see this inflection point where the establishment of new state-owned protected areas actually decreases after that, which makes sense. There was a complete reshuffle of institutions, shifting of resources, etc. But in the private space, we actually see an increase in privately protected areas being established post-1994, presumably this opening up of foreign investment, increased positivity in the future trajectory of the country, etc. But again, to reiterate, these changes in policies that enabled private land conservation to emerge. Now, what's being shown on this figure is actually only privately protected areas, which are private nature reserves or contract parks. They are formally gazetted in South Africa. We have actually quite progressive legislation in South Africa, in the sense that under our Protected Areas Act, private land can actually be declared as protected and receive the same legal status as, for example, our national parks. So this map shows you the different kinds of private land conservation in South Africa, and those formally recognized privately protected areas comprise about 2% of the country, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's also important to bear in mind that South Africa actually only has our entire formal protected area estate is actually only 8% of the country's land area. So it's a long way off the 17% that we were supposed to be at to reach the Aichi target by 2020. But what that does mean is that 2% is actually a quarter of our entire protected area estate. But perhaps even more important is that in addition to that formal contribution of private land to the protected area estate, we also see this vast extent of private land in South Africa that's engaging in some sort of wildlife-based land use. So that's harder to quantify exactly how much it is because there's no paper trail, but it's estimated to be between 14 and 17% of the country's land area. Now, this extent of private land under wildlife in South Africa has not gone unnoticed. Our National Protected Area Expansion Strategy puts a strong emphasis on private land in terms of the government recognizing that as a viable and also efficient way to extend the protected area estate. So an emphasis being placed on private land in terms of its potential to contribute to conservation in South Africa. But in addition to that, we also have the biodiversity economy strategy, which recognizes the potential of private land through the wildlife ranching sector to actually contribute to socioeconomic development and particularly rural economies in South Africa. So that strategy is really geared at growing the wildlife economy in South Africa and also transforming it because of the historic injustice around the distribution and ownership of land in South Africa. The majority of players in the wildlife economy are still white landowners. And so there's a strong push by the government to also make the wildlife economy in South Africa more inclusive and supportive of Black emerging farmers. So we see this interesting interplay between conservation and sustainable development in terms of the private land and wildlife space in South Africa and also in other Southern African countries. And so a question that then emerges, which is what most of my research has been trying to unpack and address, is, well, can we rely on these privately and informally, in many cases, conserved areas into the future in terms of their ability to contribute to both conservation as well as to livelihoods, to socioeconomic development? So in order to answer this question, one thing we need to know firstly is, well, are these areas actually located in regions that have high biodiversity? Are they actually complementary in terms of what they can offer? Recognizing that, again, this isn't like a protected area expansion strategy where areas are specifically selected to become protected because they have high biodiversity value. These areas are emergent. They come about because landowners decide that that is the most viable land use for them. So it's not, doesn't have an overarching plan. So then the question is this bottom-up emergence actually contributing in terms of conservation value? And so to answer this question, I undertook a study in the Cape Floristic region, which is in the Western Cape here in South Africa, which is where I'm actually based. This is a biodiversity hotspot. It's known for its high diversity and endemism of flora, which is also quite threatened. And I aim to assess the capacity of privately protected areas to contribute to regional scale mammal conservation in this area. And what we knew going into the study, and this is not necessarily just specific to the Cape Floristic region, is that we have these historic biases in the distribution of private and state land across high versus low productivity landscapes, respectively. And this is common in many regions where the most productive landscapes are often privately owned. By contrast, many of you may be aware of that protected area work that found the high and far bias in the occurrence of protected areas, particularly historically, in the sense that protected areas, state protected areas, tended to be established in parts of the landscape where they didn't compete with other land uses and which were aesthetic. So often, for example, in mountainous areas that weren't actually threatened by farming, etc. So we knew we had this bias in the distribution of private versus state land. We also knew, as I've said so far, that there's been this increasing focus of private landowners on wildlife-based enterprises. And we also suspected that there would be conservation trade-offs influencing the expansion of state protected areas, in the sense that, as I mentioned, the Cape Floristic region is a biodiversity hotspot predominantly because of its flora. And so to conserve, for example, a small patch of threatened vegetation is not necessarily going to result in protected area expansion in the same places as would be required to support a large mammal community. So the state has limited resources in terms of protected area expansion to start with, and the expansion that they do undertake is not necessarily going to be in areas that are good for mammals, but rather for plants. And so that led us to predict that privately protected areas would be likely to be making a greater contribution to mammal conservation relative to their extent than state protected areas. And the reason that we were able to test this prediction is because of the excellent data that were compiled by Andrei Boshoff and colleagues, where they looked at historical distributions of mammals across the Cape Floristic region, accounting for their ecological requirements to estimate the densities of the entire large mammal community that each of these habitat types could support. So we could take this data and overlay on top of it data on the protected area estate to see what mammal communities and what abundance of those communities each of these areas in theory could sustain, given the habitat that exists there. And then, of course, as I mentioned, many of these areas are fenced. And so it's important to also recognize how big they are, and thus whether they actually could sustain a viable population of each of these species, given each of the species' ecological requirements. And what we found, firstly, this would have been evident on the map, is that these areas differ greatly in their sizes. I should have explained that we've got state-owned protected areas, privately protected areas, and mixed protected areas, which are these orange ones on the map. This is where there is actually private land that's been integrated into a protected area. So it's state and private land. So we see these differences in size, and this of course makes sense. Private reserves are owned by individuals, they're smaller properties than a large state protected area. By contrast, there are many more of them in the landscape than there are state protected areas. And so what we found, firstly, in terms of species alpha diversity, is that privately protected areas could sustain a much lower diversity of species individually compared to state protected areas, with mixed protected areas actually being capable of supporting the highest diversity of species. But importantly, as a system, privately protected areas could, across the Cape Floristic region, support a much higher diversity collectively of mammal species compared to state protected areas. And this is not only because there's a lot of them, it's also disproportionately high relative to their extent, and that is because they are located in parts of the landscape that are best suited to mammals based on habitat. And so really we see private land contributing two different roles towards conservation, with the first being increasing the regional scale diversity of protected species through their high number and also their prevalence in areas that are important for mammal conservation. But secondly, they're increasing of the diversity of species within individual protected areas when they're situated, so they're expanding adjacent to or within an expanding state protected areas. Now, this study, of course, is only in the Cape Floristic region of South Africa, but we have reason to believe that it is more broadly applicable. So this map shows you the Kruger National Park, which is one of our most famous parks up in the east, northeast of the country. And you can see on the western boundary, all of those smaller shapes are privately conserved areas. So again, seeing the same trend in terms of them being small but numerous and adjacent to state protected areas. Again, that map of Namibia where we see the same thing. So the potential for these findings to be relevant more broadly. And again, what they suggest is, okay, so in theory, these emergent conservation units on private land have the potential to contribute significantly to conservation based on where they are in the landscape. But whether that potential is realized is going to depend on how they're managed. Now, by contrast to state protected areas that are managed by usually a state conservation entity, which sets up a very conservation-oriented management plan, these, call it 10,000 properties in South Africa, are each managed by an individual or a collective of individuals based on their own motivations, their own resources, etc. And so what is really important in this context is to understand how management strategies actually impact the ability of these areas to conserve biodiversity. And in managing natural resources for a desired good or service, it often seems advantageous to manage that resource for predictable and optimal outcomes. So, for example, people convert savannas to monocultures so that we can optimize yield of food. We dam rivers so that we can control their flow. Essentially, what we do in many cases when we manage a natural resource is we reduce natural variability in these resources so that we can obtain predictable and optimal outcomes. But unfortunately, there's a catch. By reducing short-term variability in an ecosystem, we can increase this variability at longer time scales. So this phenomenon is known as Bode's law in linear control systems, and it was proposed by Holling and Meaf as command and control in the pathology of natural resource management. And then in 2015, Steve Carpenter and colleagues showed that this applied to natural resource systems through models. And the research that's been done on this topic has focused on how management actions impact the ecological outcomes or biophysical properties of the systems being managed, for example, the risk of a flood or a pest outbreak, etc., based on how these resources are managed. But somewhat less attention has been focused on how these management actions are influenced by manager decisions and objectives. And so my research enabled me a unique context in terms of thinking of wildlife as a natural resource, but to actually test some of these broader ideas around managing variability in the system. And so through my PhD, I interviewed 70 managers of private reserves in the Eastern and Western Cape provinces of South Africa. And to explore their decision-making, I first asked them to describe what management actions they took on their property and how frequently they undertook these actions. And I focused specifically on actions that reduced natural variability in the system. So, for example, things like cutting vegetation or bush cutting to increase and stabilize the production of vegetation for wildlife to eat, as well as, for example, the provision of artificial water points to ensure water for wildlife year-round. And then I asked managers what information they use to make these decisions, in particular, how frequently they inform their decisions based on cash flow, money, versus monitoring of the ecosystem, things like monitoring vegetation and the effects of wildlife on that vegetation. I then also looked at what the outcomes of their management were in terms of wildlife abundance and financial outcomes in terms of how much money they made from ecotourism and or hunting. And then what I did is I performed structural equation models to assess the relationships between management decision-making and ecological and economic outcomes. And what I found was that the more managers informed decision-making based on revenue generation, the more frequently they undertook these actions to reduce natural variability in the system around wildlife. And this led to higher wildlife abundance and also to more revenues. So just to talk you through these relationships, the Cape region of South Africa is semi-arid, and so it can sustain relatively low numbers of wildlife, particularly in dry seasons. Again, recognizing that these areas are typically fenced, so wildlife can't move around between them. And so by reducing natural variability in the provision of resources that wildlife needs, things like water and vegetation, it seems that managers were able to increase the number of wildlife that could be sustained. And then the more wildlife there are in a property, the more attractive it is to ecotourists. So potentially they attract more ecotourists, or they can charge them more money. And of course, if you have more wildlife, you can hunt more wildlife. So to remind you what the implications of this are, back to Bode's law, it suggests that the reduction of this variability in the system over shorter timescales might actually erode the sustainability of the system over longer timescales. For example, their capacity to cope with a bad drought. Now they have very high wildlife numbers, or even something like COVID, for example. In many cases, the intensive management is costly. They depend on revenues from tourists to sustain those revenues shut down, and ultimately these high wildlife numbers then start to erode the ecological sustainability of the system. More tangibly, what we also found is that the more intensively managers managed their system, the more likely they were to be overstocking with wildlife relative to what the vegetation could sustain. And in the short term, this potentially leads to more revenues and encourages managers to continue making these decisions. But over longer timescales, it actually changes the productivity and composition of the vegetation, thus eroding ecological sustainability. By contrast, we found opposite in the sense that managers that frequently monitored their vegetation were much less likely to undertake these intensive management actions. And so what we find here is that there are potentially these social ecological dynamics whereby managers make decisions on how to manage a system, which leads to financial outcomes. And if that's what they're monitoring, then they may slip into these unsustainable management cycles despite their good intentions. Whereas if they monitor the ecological system more, then they prevent those feedbacks from occurring. So coming back to the question of whether we can rely on these areas to conserve biodiversity and livelihoods into the future, it's really important to understand these social ecological dynamics that might slip them along one less sustainable path or another. Now, in addition to understanding their resilience to these internal dynamics, we also need to consider the context in which these areas occur. So the broader political and environmental conditions. And I, again, interviewed managers of 112 private reserves in the Cape region, and I asked them what they perceived to be the greatest threats to their conservation areas. And this is a simplified way of demonstrating those findings, where the bigger words were the ones that were more commonly mentioned by landowners in my transcriptions of what they said. And one that you see in big red letters there is poaching, and above that, rhino. And rhino, the story of rhino conservation in South Africa is a really interesting one, and one that private land plays a dominant role in. So many of you may be aware that white rhino nearly went extinct, and their numbers were declined to 100 or so in one state park in South Africa. And the decision was made to auction rhino to other people, other landowners, and in addition to allow regulated hunting of white rhino on those properties. Now, because white rhino are a really charismatic species, because they were very rare, people could charge a lot of money for a foreigner to come and trophy hunt one of those animals. And so the value of trophies was very high, but the value of live rhinos was also very high. People were buying and selling them between the properties. Rhino would then also move to other parks in South Africa, and what we saw was this incredible success story with this recovery of rhino numbers across the country. And South Africa conserves about 80% of the global population of white rhino. Unfortunately, then what happened, as many of you will know, is that poaching really escalated, and you can actually see total numbers coming back down again. And we now have a figure that's recently come out of the Kruger National Park, which is the stronghold for rhino conservation in South Africa, to say that the rhino numbers have actually declined by 30%, which is an alarming stat. And what it also means is that the proportion of rhino on private land in South Africa is now actually more than 50%. So the majority of white rhino in South Africa, who holds the majority of white rhino in the world, now actually occur on private land. And you can also see that while total numbers were declining, private land rhino ownership was actually increasing. I worked with the Private Rhino Owners Association, which wanted to get a sense of what was happening with rhino on private land in South Africa. And what we see firstly is that the price of rhino, live rhino, has come down dramatically. And what has happened is because poaching has become so rife in South Africa now, it is necessary for private landowners that have rhino to implement anti-poaching measures that cost them a lot of money to protect their rhinos from poaching. And so rhinos have become very costly, which means that the benefits that private landowners could get from rhino financially in terms of ecotourism and hunting are now starting to be more outweighed by the costs of conserving them because of these anti-poaching measures. And so what that means is that the value of rhino has actually come down. And so we, in the survey, asked private rhino owners how they were coping with the poaching crisis. And we see these three quite distinct responses. The first is that over half of the landowners are just carrying on as best they can. They have increased the amount of money they're putting into anti-poaching, but they're just sitting tight. They're trying to conserve their rhino as best they can. By contrast, we see that 28% of landowners have started to divest in rhino. So they have started to sell rhino because the costs of conserving them now are unjustifiable to them. By contrast, we see the remaining 50% of landowners actually buying up these cheap rhino that are coming onto the market. So actually what we're seeing is now the majority of white rhino in South Africa are on private land, but also we're seeing a consolidation of rhino into fewer populations on private land, which raises interesting questions about the resilience of rhino conservation going forward. What we think may be happening is that this purchase of more rhino by some landowners is speculative in the sense that they are hoping that rhino horn trade becomes legalized, which would enable them to harvest sustainably and sell horn onto that market, which would enable them to make quite a lot of money out of the rhino. If that does not happen, then there's a question of what this consolidation of rhino on private land means for conservation going forward. Again, not saying the trade should necessarily be legalized. That's a whole nother conversation, but just these interesting dynamics when private landowners come into the fore, where here they've really helped to conserve a species, bring it back from the brink of extinction, but interesting question marks going forward about the resilience of conservation efforts. Another big concern for landowners engaging in the wildlife economy is the growing anti-hunting sentiments that we see around the world. As I mentioned, hunting, particularly trophy hunting, is one of the main ways in which these areas are viable, generate revenues and thus livelihoods from wildlife. And so these growing anti-hunting sentiments are important to consider in terms of what they could mean for our ability to rely on these areas going forward. And we had a student, Kim Parker, who surveyed private landowners in South Africa and asked them what would they do in the event of a hunting ban. And what's interesting here is that often the assumption is that hunting is not necessary because landowners or communities or even state parks can rather do ecotourism. There's no need for hunting. And what we found is that actually only a third of the landowners interviewed said that they would transition or scale up ecotourism. Another third said that they would actually go back to livestock farming if hunting got banned. And the remaining third said they actually had no idea what they could do because they didn't see any other viable land use on their property. And I put this table up, it's a lot of words, but I put it up because it's interesting in terms of the reasons that landowners gave for why they can't transition to ecotourism instead of hunting. So this idea that ecotourism actually has a much higher barrier to entry than hunting because it requires a nicer lodge, more staff to serve that lodge, etc. So a lot of investment in infrastructure is needed to do ecotourism in ways that's viable. Many also perceived that they were too far away from tourism hubs close to, for example, cities to actually bring in the numbers. And related to numbers, the idea that the perception that ecotourism is less profitable, it has lower margins than trophy hunting. You need more people essentially to make the same kinds of returns. Also this perception that the market is saturated, etc. So again, this is just landowners' perceptions of what they would do in the event of a hunting ban, but it raises interesting questions in terms of their context within this much broader political this much broader context in terms of international perceptions around what is good and what is bad and what the implications of those could be. And so, as Nikki said, one of the projects that I've now started to work more on is to actually build an evidence base around the role or not of trophy hunting, moving outside of South Africa to across Southern and Sub-Saharan Africa. And really the idea being that this is it's one of the most controversial topics in conservation, but there is actually relatively little evidence to support the arguments pro or against hunting. So, for example, it's often put across as an argument to stop hunting that it's unsustainable for the species being hunted. It's also this debate about whether the money that goes towards hunting actually then funds conservation. So in South Africa, maybe that's more clear. Elsewhere, we're less sure who actually benefits as well. Does the money actually go to, for example, in South Africa, where there's private landowners, the link is clearer, but in other sub-Saharan African countries where there's communities involved, who actually benefits? What are the socioeconomic contributions, and can the ethical concerns around trophy hunting actually be addressed? So this is one of the perceived threats to conservation outside of protected areas in Southern Africa that I hope to address through building an evidence base. I've just started on that, but to start, myself and my colleague Enrico Dominen and others at the University of Helsinki did a global review of the recreational hunting literature just to see what's out there. And as part of that, I did a meta-analysis to see what evidence there is that hunting has led to population declines of the species being hunted. So this figure shows you those results for Africa. The first thing to bear in mind is that there's actually not a lot of evidence. In brackets, there are the number of studies that have assessed this for the different species. You can see there's only a handful for which there's actually a decent sample size. Interestingly, what we see for the majority of species is that there's no evidence that it leads to declines, but there are some notable exceptions. Particularly larger species like elephant, it has in some cases led to declines, and also the predators, about 50% of the evidence suggests that it's led to declines. So this again is context specific. In some cases, the quotas were inappropriate. There's also examples of how quotas have then been reassessed, or a temporary ban has been put in place to reassess quotas to make to ensure that hunting becomes more sustainable. But really the need for more evidence to assess the contributions of hunting, or what makes it work, where and why, to address these growing global anti-hunting sentiments and what they could actually mean for conservation in Southern Africa. So the last potential threat that I'm going to talk about, which also stands out quite clearly here, is government and legislation. In South Africa in particular, it's an interesting dynamic where these farmers were doing they were farmers, they were practicing agriculture, livestock husbandry, etc. And then because wildlife became the most viable land use, they transitioned over to wildlife, and then suddenly they fell under conservation. And many of the regulations then focus on conservation, so ensuring that they, for example, don't move species around that shouldn't be found in that area. They don't introduce species that could potentially hybridize with each other, etc. Essentially treating them in some ways as protected areas. And then this pushback from this industry to say, but we're not protected areas. These are productive landscapes. We're trying to have a livelihood on this land. And so really this tension around legislation that comes out very commonly when you speak to private landowners engaged in the wildlife economy. And so there is currently a project that's being spearheaded through the South African National Biodiversity Institute in collaboration with the Department of Environment, and also working with the industry to see if we can't meet halfway. So instead of trying to review private land conservation and these wildlife ranches as protected areas, which they are not, they are along the spectrum of working landscapes, but they certainly are contributing much more to sustainable land management and conservation than alternative land uses that would otherwise be occurring on those areas, things like crop farming, etc. Is there a way to understand more holistically the contributions that they do make to sustainable land management and conservation, while recognizing that they are also working landscapes? So really this shift from viewing them as protected areas to viewing them as functional agroecological systems. So one of the potential avenues that's being tabled is thinking about whether there can be some sort of certification scheme for wildlife-based land uses to incentivize them to manage the land that's in ways that's sustainable, that then, for example, increases the value of the products that they provide, be it ecotourism or hunting, etc. And to this end, there is now a project, again, being spearheaded by SANBI in collaboration and funded by the government, but also working closely with the industry to try and actually understand what the contributions are that these wildlife ranches in South Africa make to not only sustainable land management and conservation, but also in terms of their socioeconomic footprint. For example, something that we found through this survey, which we've already been able to employ 37 recent graduates to undertake these surveys across the Eastern Cape, and the idea is to roll it out nationally. One of the things we find is that these areas, for example, employ more people per unit area than do livestock farms. They also upskill them, and they employ more women, because you need women, for example, to work in lodges, etc. So trying to understand these socioeconomic contributions that these areas make, but also their contributions to sustainable land management and the challenges that they face, such that legislation can shift towards recognizing that these are working systems, and so they do have this contribution to make, but we also have to recognize that they need to be viable, but also guarding against potential unsustainable management that could occur on them. So to conclude, coming back to this question of whether we can rely on these areas into the future to contribute both to conservation, but also to socioeconomic development, hopefully through my talk, it's become clear to you that to answer this question, we have to view these as systems. They're not isolated, they're not ecosystems, they're social ecological systems that emerge and evolve in this global landscape. And we really have to have an understanding of manager objectives, needs, global scale threats, and how to recognize those and to enable or to create policy that creates enabling environments to actually support sustainable wildlife economies going forward. So I will conclude there. I don't know how I did for time. Oh, not so bad. Thank you for your time. I welcome any reflections, questions, suggestions, etc.
Thanks, Hayley. That was a really great talk. It was really interesting. If anyone, maybe you guys want to put on your cameras, so it's nice to see some faces.
So I feel like I'm not talking into the void anymore.
So if you've got any questions, just raise your hand, or you can put it in the chat and I can call on you. But I thought maybe I'd start off. I know you've just started the trophy hunting project, but one of the things that struck me was you said that trophy hunting in a way contributes to increasing the value, the economic value of a species, and then they're more expensive, people get more value by having them on their land. Mm-hmm. Have you started, or have you noticed any studies or any indication that when there is a trophy hunting ban, like for example what Botswana is sort of facing, that it does reduce the value of the species, and so that results in a negative feedback, or is that still a question to be answered?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm now going to do a meta-analysis where I try to understand these links better, based on, firstly, just to see what evidence is out there to support or dispute those kinds of claims elsewhere, recognizing also that other systems are a bit different to South Africa, where it is very commercialized here. There's a lot of buying and selling and trade of wildlife, etc. Whether that's the case elsewhere, I'm not entirely sure. So it'll be interesting to see, as you say, what there's many feedbacks that a ban can result in. And what the outcomes of those are. But as you say, what is useful is that they have, so countries like Kenya enacted a ban quite a long time ago that has persisted. By contrast, Botswana enacted a ban that they then subsequently lifted. And then there's research like ours from South Africa, and there's also research in Namibia that have looked at what the implications of a hypothetical ban would be. So we've got these kind of different cases which serve as sort of different tests or controls in a way to be able to tease out some of those dynamics.
It would be very interesting, because I mean, also like the UK or something, where people talk about fox hunting and bans like that, if that's sort of related at all, or if it's a completely different standalone.
Yeah, and so that review that I mentioned that we just did was actually a global review. And what I had not realized, but what was interesting, is that so in an African context, trophy hunting is the big one by international hunters, and there's these concerns about growing anti-hunting sentiments. Whereas in Europe and in North America, what actually comes out in the literature is the concern that there's just less interest in hunting. So in different European countries and also in the States, hunting is either on state land and contributes towards a fund that goes towards, for example, restoring wetlands for water birds that are hunted, etc. Or also in some European countries, it's also on private land. But the idea that there's less interest in hunting by local people wanting to go hunting, particularly in younger generations. And so a similar kind of discussion about what that then means for those areas that either were funded, state areas funded by hunting, or private land that was doing that because it was a good option for them to maintain natural habitats because there was hunting revenues. So yeah, so a slightly different dynamic in terms of local hunters versus foreign hunters, but similar questions in terms of what the implications will be for conservation.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Does anyone have any questions? Want to go? Maybe just raise your hand or just you.
Yes,
Thank
thanks, Hayley, for a fantastic talk. It probably helps that it's my pet topic, but I thought you.
Well, thanks. It's nice to see you, Michael.
That was great. Thank you. So my question is in two parts, and if the answer to the first question is no, the second part is irrelevant. But have you looked at all at the report of the high-level panel? Okay, so that's a yes.
I've read the synopsis, what do you call it? The main policy recommendations. It's a bit of a beast, but it's on my list, yeah.
It's still unclear how because the recommendations are open to interpretation as to how they would actually be implemented. But they do leave open the possibility for a fairly stringent interpretation that would put an enormous amount of pressure on the whole private sector. And I was just keen to hear your reflections as to what the consequence of a sort of a harsher interpretive implementation of the high-level panel report might result in, especially for rhinos.
Yeah, good question. And I would love to hear your perspective as well afterwards. But just for people in the room that don't know what this is a high-level panel that was recently produced on was it 5 species, Michael? Rhino, elephant, lion.
The two rhinos. Yeah, there was lots of confusion because rhino is not one species. Yeah.
Yeah. So an assessment of these species and how to regulate their management going forward. And as Michael says, some interpretations could be really a clamping down on the production element of wildlife. So the more, I mean, if we go back to my figure, the more intensive kinds of systems that really produce and sell these animals. And certainly the way the minister is speaking, it sounds like that interpretation has legs. So in terms of the implications of that, I feel like there's such a conflicted policy space at the moment, and I speak about it a bit. You asked specifically about rhino in that paper we published, where internationally they're saying trophy, so that is in the case of horns, the trade in horns is banned. You can't do it, you can't make money from it. Whereas in some ways, if that was arguably well regulated, it could promote or it would create another revenue stream to encourage rhino to be viable on private land if it was coupled with local regulations that prevented or disincentivized really the intensive production of rhino, because that is obviously a concern, is that where does conservation end? Just because you've got a lot of rhino doesn't necessarily mean they're contributing ecologically to a system if you're intensively farming them. But then by contrast, what we're seeing is that that's not allowed. The costs of trophy of poaching or preventing poaching are so high that there's not a lot of incentive for private landowners to keep these animals anymore. And now we've seen this shift in the Animal Improvement Act in South Africa that would actually enable production more of rhino. So we see the strange, I think, interplay where we're not creating incentives that actually would enable or fund the viable conservation of rhino in extensive systems, but then there's this conflicting policy that potentially enables more intensive systems to come about. So I think it's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And ultimately what that means, I'm not sure what that means, but I think, you know, we do, again, coming back to my last slide, this industry does need to be regulated, but we need to think about ways to regulate the industry that incentivize extensive systems, wildlife for conservation, as opposed to just hammering down with these really restrictive incentives that just say, well, wildlife's not viable, do something else. So I guess that would be my take on it, but I would love to hear your take on it, Michael.
May I follow up with a comment and a question, or is
yeah, please.
So certainly, and for the sake of full disclosure, I was a member of the high-level panel, but certainly the sentiment amongst the entire panel was that we do want to transition to a more sort of extensive wildlife industry, and we wanted to move away from intensive. But I was wondering, in your work and in your research, and well, I guess you were mostly focused on the Western Cape, where the situation is a little bit different. But one hypothesis is that, okay, so the Game Theft Act incentivized the erection of fences, obviously, because that was one way to create ownership, and then arguably could therefore incentivize a move towards more intensive production systems. But there's another factor that might be playing into all of this, and that is security. It may well be that white South African farmers who are under a lot of pressure, farm killings, farm murders, all those kinds of things, with then very valuable species, also started creating lagers almost, right, to protect their more valuable species. So that's a security drive, and particularly in respect of rhinos. I mean, the South Africa's largest rhino breeding facility was strategically placed in what was considered to be the most secure part of the country. So I was wondering to what extent you'd picked up that security story in your research, and whether that's a factor to consider as well.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, because I think I see Dave Balfour's also on the call, and we've had these conversations as well. You know, that we see rhino numbers continue to go well. In theory, based on the data we have, at least until 2017, rhino numbers still going up on private land, whereas they're going down elsewhere. And the idea being that of course it is, you know, any private reserve is a hell of a lot smaller than the Kruger. It is much easier to conserve, well, arguably it's much easier to protect wildlife in smaller systems than it is in somewhere like the Kruger, which borders on Mozambique, etc. And so I think that argument potentially holds actually across the board, which again comes back to this interesting conversation about conserving animals versus ecosystems, and conserving the contributions that wildlife makes to ecosystem function versus high numbers of those individuals. So I didn't answer your question because I'm not sure in terms of the kind of intensification or fragmentation of existing private reserves to increase the kind of fortress mentality to protect them from poaching. But certainly, I think that is one of the reasons why wildlife has done well in general on these small contained private reserves compared to the parks. And again, I think, you know, we need both to really, you know, increase the resilience of our conservation strategy. But also, you know, the point that you made in terms of the certificate of adequate enclosure, and there's been a lot of discussion around that. And for others, you know, I mentioned that how South Africa handled the let's give ownership rights of wildlife to individuals is through fencing. Like, if you can prove they're yours, then they can be yours and you can use them. But of course, what that in theory created was a fragmented system, in the sense that now everybody sticks up these electric fences that wildlife can't move through so that they can prove that they're theirs. So we've increased wildlife numbers, but we've fragmented the system. So there's interesting dynamics around that as well, compared to other African countries where that is the case to a lesser extent, but then also where there are much higher threats of poaching, etc., because they're not fenced. So it's a tricky one.
Any other questions?
Hi, yeah, I have some. I'm Helen, I'm a PhD student. at UCL Anthropology and the Zoological Society of London doing a project looking at trophy hunting actually and the impacts of the Botswana hunting ban.
Amazing.
So I have two questions for you. One of them sort of touches on something that Michael raised and was something that I noticed in your word cloud, which was how sort of two of the big concerns were around government and like political concerns. And I was wondering how, or like sort of if you could elaborate on that a little bit more, particularly sort of around sort of whether there are concerns around land redistribution, partly because like one of the big differences between like hunting in South Africa or private land conservation in general and elsewhere is how few communities actually seem to be involved, at least from what I've seen, which is very different from a lot of other African systems, and sort of how much pushback I guess there is from the general populace around that. And then the other question was around one of your sort of aspects of the review that you're doing around the ethical concerns and how you sort of plan to examine those and sort of try and look into whether there are any ways of appeasing some of those concerns. Yeah, so those two questions.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Really nice to meet you. And I would love to hear more about what you're doing, because I think that is such an interesting system to be working in. So I'm very excited to hear more about what you find there. Exactly, land comes up. Land and government and politics is huge in terms of land, the concerns of game ranchers in South Africa. And you are right that a major concern is around land reform. When you talk about any land use in South Africa, you're talking about land, and land is a very contested issue. And the reality in South Africa is that because of the past and the injustices of the past, land is unfairly distributed in South Africa. The majority of landowners are white, and so that translates into everything. It translates into farming, it translates into the wildlife economy, etc., in terms of who is currently participating. So there's a couple of dimensions to that. The one is that in terms of the contributions of, okay, well, let me start with the concern. So that it comes up as this concern around land. Landowners are concerned. Foreign landowners, there's a lot of foreign landowners also involved in wildlife ranching in South Africa. In theory, the idea is that that's halting investment in wildlife ranching because there's this concern around land reform, particularly land reform without expropriation that's now become a topic in South Africa. Interestingly, there's also speculation that landowners transition into wildlife and particularly also choose to declare their land as protected in some way because they think that prevents land reform. And also actually what happens when landowners transition from farming to wildlife is that often it involves the consolidation of properties. Many previous farms become a wildlife ranch, which also there's conjecture that minimizes the potential for land reform. So again, we work in this really contested and complicated space in terms of conservation for who. And if the fear of land reform is resulting in wildlife conservation, what does that mean? Is that good or bad? How do we cope with that? So that is definitely a big topic, an important one to engage with. Related to that, as I mentioned, the biodiversity economy strategy in South Africa is very much focused on transforming the industry. So land reform is happening in South Africa. It's important that it happens. And so Black emerging farmers are now receiving land. And what we've learned through engagement with the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform through this project that's being spearheaded by Sanbi, I see Matt Child and a couple of other colleagues also on the call, is that all of the policy towards supporting new entrants or emerging farmers is actually geared towards agriculture in terms of extension support, know-how, etc. Some of these properties have incredible wildlife. Some of them actually were wildlife farms, etc. But there's not sufficient support for new farmers to actually engage in the wildlife economy. And part of that is because it's costly to enter into, and part of it is because there just isn't the existing knowledge products to support that compared to agriculture, which is a much more established sector. So the hope is to start to build that evidence base to actually shift policy to create a more inclusive wildlife economy in South Africa. But we are certainly a long way off that. And to your point around, so this is a long answer, but it's an important discussion, and the point around the extent to which communities in South Africa are actually involved, there's also a lot of debate around that, because there's some nice work that's come out of Kruger and the surrounding reserves to show that these private reserves actually, because they're quite high end, they actually employ a lot more people per unit area than does the Kruger. So they actually make a big socioeconomic contribution to those surrounding communities than if they didn't exist or if they were farms. Also, I mentioned the work that shows that these reserves employ many more people and upskill them compared to other kinds of farms. So there's some evidence to suggest that this is good in terms of inclusion and upskilling of rural populations. But there's also arguments that often these areas move people off the land, and there's discussion on both sides. It's really contested, and this is why it's also really important that we build the evidence base to create more inclusive wildlife economies than what we have at the moment. I forgot you asked another question as well. That was like a really long answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just to sort of follow on from that, it's sort of, there's quite an interesting difference between the sort of employment opportunities created by photographic and ecotourism and the opportunities created by hunting tourism, because I think there have been some studies in the Karoo which showed the opposite actually, and that fewer people are employed on trophy hunting farms than they were even on livestock farms, and conditions for farm workers have gone down since that transition. Is that sort of the case elsewhere as well, or?
This is the data we're currently collecting. So those, if you're talking about the studies that I think you are, they're case study based, and so those are important to have, but we need to understand more across the board what are the trends that we see. So part of that project that I mentioned that's being run at the moment is to collect like a large database to try and understand these things. What are the different business models? What are the implications for their socioeconomic contributions, etc. Because exactly these dynamics are really important. I think people just kind of see wildlife as this one big thing, but it's important to understand the nuance. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so the other question was around the ethics of, you said you were going to review sort of like ethics and all the concerns around those, which are very prominent here in the UK and sort of Western world.
Yeah. Yes, and the ethical dimension is certainly not my expertise. We had a colleague who touched on that a little bit in the paper in terms of like whose value systems are really being gaining airtime in this whole debate, and how do we shift that. But in terms of my project, I was actually quite interested to run some choice experiments to try and understand whether, if a hunt is sustainable, if it is contributing to conservation, if it is supporting local communities, etc., these various dimensions, does that actually influence what hunters are willing to pay for it? There've been some smaller studies that have looked at that, but a broader one to see, of course, it's so polarized that some people don't, hunting is bad regardless, but is there a market for hunts that are more ethical in terms of the dimensions of ethics that the world seems to think are important when it comes to hunting? So it was more in that space to try and unpack it a bit. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear if you've unpacked it at all, because it is a whole nother field.
No, not at all. And it's one that scares me too. But it's just sort of like, from the impression that I get, is like really hard line against trophy hunting, and sort of almost like there's no amount of evidence will change people's opinions.
Yes.
And so how to actually get past that, particularly considering that they're not going to be the ones who are affected by those decisions. Yes. So it was really interesting sort of outcome from work in Botswana is basically all the community members that I spoke to wanted trophy hunting to be brought back, because it had affected them badly. But like those people aren't necessarily going to be the ones who affect policy, whether it's sort of like national policy of the ban, which was lifted in the end, partly because it was very unpopular. But also, I mean, like sort of whether that'll change like an import ban from trophies to like the US, for example, which is the main market.
Yeah.
But I'd be interesting to hear from Mike, who says he's done work on that.
Mike, please, it would be great to have you weigh in.
I see there was another question for you, and I don't want
sorry.
to. I don't want to. Kerry, did you still have your question?
I do, but it's not on this. So if you want to speak on this, that's fine.
I'll just say very quickly. I mean, the ethics around trophy hunting are very complex, and there's an interesting paper recently, a review by a chap called Benjamin Gassemi, which came out last year. But what's interesting is he looks at the different ethical schools of thought, or the different ethical theories and ways of approaching this issue. There's a virtue ethics approach, there's a deontological approach, there's a consequentialist approach, which tends to look more at evidence. What's interesting, though, is his evaluation of the consequentialist approach, which is the evidence-based approach, really cherry picks a lot of studies that many of which were commissioned by groups known to be fundamentally opposed to trophy hunting. So that review, I would say, is extremely biased. So, and my own PhD research is on this very topic of debates around sustainability, and to what extent are they evidence-based, and to what extent are they informed by moral intuitions and moral positions. And the two conflate very easily. It's very easy to have a moral position on something, and then for confirmation bias to creep into your research, and this is rife in this space. So I'll just say that, and I'm happy to share more information and research on this with you if you like.
Kerry?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It would be great to read more of what you've done in your deep dive into that topic. I think how I console myself is that even if some people perhaps are not listening to the evidence, I still think it's important that we build that evidence base. As you say, in many cases that evidence has been built in a subjective way based on who's done it and for who, etc. And so I think, the work that Helen's doing on the ground and these kind of more objective meta-analyses to see, well, what is the bulk of the evidence suggesting, are really important to at least have as the foundation, even if not necessarily everybody is going to take that on board. Sorry, Kerry. Nice to see you, Kerry. Are you in Cape Town? Where are you?
I'm in Cape Town. Yeah, good to see you as well. It's been long. Yeah, for everyone else, I'm from Stellenbosch. I worked with Nikki for a while. I'm still in Global Change Biology group at Stellenbosch University, working on climate change impacts, just broadly on biodiversity at the moment. So then obviously what stood out to me, Hayley, is that obviously there's projections of in the future new species assemblages forming because of climate change, and also like on that assisted translocation and creating these like novel ecosystems, and obviously trying to conserve specific species by doing that, so not conserving ecosystems. And so I know you've touched on it already, but I'm just wondering like where the conversation is going with this. So obviously it used to be very traditional, so traditional conservation, but we know, and you've already mentioned it, that parks here, private parks, just buy any and every animal that looks nice. Up in the Eastern Cape, where my parents live, one of our neighbors bought giraffes, and they stick out like sore thumbs. They do not fit in that
They're like grazing.
Yeah, but I mean, they're doing really well there, and they're breeding, and so you would see that and be like, that's great for that particular species. But so I'm just wondering where that conversation is going. Our conservation is starting to change towards accepting novel ecosystems, or
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Kerry, and I think it depends who you ask. I think that there are different groups of conservationists that have very different perspectives on that. But this kind of shifting baselines, or what do we compare to, what are we trying to get back to, is really interesting to think about. And giraffe is an excellent example. And giraffe is the reason why many private reserves choose not to become formally protected, because then they can't have giraffe. And there's nothing else that looks like a giraffe if you're doing ecotourism, you know. So, but yeah, there are many interesting conversations around that. For example, we see a lot of bush encroachment also in South Africa now, which means there's potentially a lot more food for giraffe than there used to be. Also, you know, as you said, there's these assisted translocations. Sometimes species went in an area just because they couldn't get there. So again, I tend to feel like we have to meet somewhere in the middle. You know, these are all novel systems. Like, no private reserve, even our biggest one, is a natural system. You know, in many cases, this wildlife has been reintroduced. It used to be farmland. These are all novel systems. But then, you know, where along the spectrum are we comfortable to sit? Is a good question, and one that I think, you know, we need to grapple with, because I think this very hard line, pristine, let's get back to what it was, conservation, is just not practical for many of these areas. So I think we need to move more into the novel ecosystem spectrum, but I would be nervous to go all the way. So these
I'm
are
nervous to say that in just any setting. One of our students did a presentation on assisted translocation of proteas, and it turned from her presentation to just like a full-on like shouting debate between different academics, and so it's a touchy subject, I know.
Wow, shame. That's horrific for a student to go through. But exactly as you say, I mean, so many of the conversations we're now having are really value laden at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this complex.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on that, in the context of climate change, though, isn't everything a novel ecosystem to some extent? So higher CO2, woody encroachment. You can't return to some pristine baseline if you wanted to.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, you know, that's why this conversation that we're having, Matt Child could speak more to this with this project that he's now leading, is really to try and shift the conversation away from species and what ecosystem should be there to sustainable land management. So it's, you know, are these areas contributing in terms of the restoration of natural land, in terms of preventing the transformation of natural habitats over to cultivation or degradation, etc. So to try and like shift the conversation a little bit away from, you know, should you have giraffe or not? But yeah, not everyone agrees with that, and it is tricky.
Mm-hmm. Just to follow up on your another aspect of your work. So you mentioned this global review that you did. I was interested in some of the ecological findings that you reported from Africa around the gamma diversity and the role that private land played in that. Outside the African context, have you come across evidence of what happens in North America or Europe and other places in that role of private protected areas?
Sorry, just to make sure I understand your question, do you mean in terms of what those areas contribute in terms of complementarity, or do you mean particularly in terms of hunting, what the implications of that are?
And complementarity, I think more the ecological complementarity, biodiversity, richness and conservation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a need for a global study that takes all of the problem with private land is that we don't know where it all is, these conserved areas. Firstly, there was a lot of debate of how to define them at all. And they've started to feature in the World Database on Protected Areas now, but not comprehensive. So I haven't seen a global review, but there's been work, for example, out of Peru and Brazil that has also showed that they are quite complementary in terms of what they conserve. In some parts of the states, they've shown that, and in others not, actually. In Australia, the coverage of private protected areas is very low. But what's quite interesting there is that it's a very different model. In other parts of the world, it's very much more incentive-based than market-based. So in Southern Africa, these areas emerge because it's a viable land use. In in other parts of the world, particularly, for example, in Australia, the government says, you're on private land, it's got good biodiversity, please set aside a portion and we'll pay you for it. So it's a different kind of model. But also what you see in Australia is that there's actually a lot of NGOs that buy up land for conservation, and they focus specifically on endangered marsupials. So in that sense, they've done very well to conserve certain populations of highly threatened species. And again, this idea that they're small and they often occur in more kind of fragmented landscapes. Yeah, but the extent of them there is extremely low. So their like overall contribution is very low. In Europe, I haven't actually seen any studies that have tried to look at complementarity. So yeah, it's on my list of things to do. Maybe someone else can do it, but it would be, I think, really interesting to see around the world what trends emerge. Yeah.
So if there are no other burning questions, I think we should end it there. It's getting to late Friday afternoon. But thank you so much, Hayley. That was really great. It's actually a huge amount of work that you've done over the years, and it's really nice to see it all together. And I'm really interested to see how your hunting studies are going to turn out. It looks really intriguing. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
You say we have a tradition in these seminars to unmute the microphones so that there's audible applause for the speaker.
Yay! Well, thank you very much, Advinda and Nikki. This has been a lovely discussion. I wish we could have a lot more discussion, but hopefully in due course we can. But thanks very much for the opportunity, and it's been lovely to see some familiar faces and meet some new ones. So thank you, and have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, that was really interesting.
Cheers.